She filed 14 complaints. 14. Over a garden. She rallied the HOA, called the city, and even showed up at the front door with a printed rulebook. But what she never saw coming was that her own obsession would hand her opponent the one weapon she could never fight. Some neighborhoods have that one person, the one who watches from behind half-closed blinds, who memorizes the HOA rulebook like scripture, and who treats every blade of grass that grows 2 inches too tall like a personal attack. In this story, that person was a woman the internet would come to know simply as Karen, and her target was a homeowner named Daniel, a quiet, meticulous man who had spent 3 years transforming the backyard of his property into something genuinely beautiful. Daniel wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't loud. He didn't throw parties, and he paid every bill on time. What he did have was a deep, almost spiritual passion for native plant gardening. His backyard had slowly become a carefully designed landscape of wildflowers, ornamental grasses, native shrubs, and a small natural pond he had dug himself, fed by rainwater runoff and lined with smooth river stones. To any reasonable person walking by, it looked like a page torn out of a gardening magazine. To Karen, it looked like a violation. The first complaint arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under Daniel's front door in a standard HOA envelope. He almost laughed reading it. The complaint cited unapproved landscaping modifications and demanded that he remove all plantings not listed on the HOA's pre-approved vegetation list, a list that, Daniel quickly discovered, had been written in 1987 and hadn't been updated since. The list included things like standard Kentucky bluegrass, boxwood hedges, and red mulch. That was essentially it. Daniel wrote a polite, detailed response to the HOA board, explaining that his plants were all native species, environmentally beneficial, and well within his property boundaries. He attached photographs, botanical names, and even a letter from a local horticulture society praising his garden design. He genuinely believed that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, a second complaint arrived. Same language, slightly different wording. Daniel responded again, this time with more documentation. He cited city environmental guidelines that actually encouraged native plantings. He mentioned water conservation. He was thorough, professional, and patient. The HOA board, most of whom, it turned out, had no idea who was filing the complaints, issued a vague non-response and closed the case. Then came complaint number 3, and 4, and 5. Each one followed the same pattern. Karen would file a written grievance with the HOA, citing a slightly different subclause each time. This time it was about the height of ornamental grasses. Then it was about the pond being an unapproved water feature. Then it was about alleged debris accumulation, which turned out to be, upon inspection, a small pile of decorative stones Daniel had arranged near the garden's edge. The HOA inspector who came to look at the property stood in Daniel's backyard for about 4 minutes, looked around slowly, shook his head, and told Daniel, off the record, that the garden looked incredible and he personally didn't see a single issue. But complaints were complaints. The process had to be followed. By complaint number 7, Daniel had hired a property attorney just to handle the paperwork. By complaint number 10, he had built an entire filing system dedicated solely to Karen-related documentation, dates, times, complaint numbers, HOA responses, photographs, and correspondence. His attorney told him that while none of the complaints had resulted in any actual fines or legal action, the sheer volume of them could eventually be used to pressure him into making changes. The HOA had a clause, buried deep in the covenants, that allowed them to mandate landscaping corrections if a property received more than a certain number of unresolved complaints within a 2-year window. Daniel was getting close to that threshold, and Karen knew it. What became clear over time, through conversations with other neighbors, through HOA meeting minutes that Daniel had begun attending and recording, and through a particularly revealing exchange between Karen and the HOA board secretary that another neighbor witnessed and reported, was that this wasn't really about the garden. Karen had decided, early on, that Daniel's property looked different from everyone else's. And different, in her mind, meant wrong. She had appointed herself the enforcer of a conformity that nobody else had asked for, and she had found in the HOA rulebook the perfect weapon to pursue it. The fact that Daniel's garden was genuinely beautiful, environmentally responsible, and entirely harmless made no difference to her. What mattered was that it didn't look like everybody else's lawn, and that was enough. Complaints 11, 12, and 13 arrived over a 4-month stretch. By this point, Daniel had stopped being patient. He had stopped being polite in his responses. His attorney was now sending formal letters back to the HOA pointing out procedural errors in how the complaints were being processed, challenging the validity of the 1987 vegetation list as a legally enforceable document, and quietly building a case. But Daniel himself had also started thinking bigger. He had started doing research. Late nights, browser tabs stacked on browser tabs, reading about property law, conservation designations, environmental land classifications, and a particular legal mechanism he'd stumbled across almost by accident. One that, if it applied to his property, would change everything. He reached out to a local environmental consultant. He had his backyard assessed. He sent soil samples and water samples to a lab. He documented the species of birds, insects, and amphibians that had begun using his garden as habitat, including, notably, 3 species of native bees that were on a state-monitored conservation watch list. And then, on the same week that complaint number 14 landed in his mailbox, Daniel received a letter back from the environmental consultant that made him set down his coffee cup and sit very, very still. The letter confirmed what the early research had suggested. His backyard, the pond, the native plantings, the carefully cultivated ecosystem he had spent 3 years building, met every qualifying criterion for official wetland designation under both state environmental law and federal conservation guidelines. He picked up the phone and called his attorney. There is a specific kind of satisfaction that comes not from anger, not from revenge in the petty sense of the word, but from watching a system that was used against you become the very thing that protects you permanently. Daniel hadn't set out to build a legal wetland. He had set out to build a garden. But Karen's obsession had pushed him down a road she never anticipated. And at the end of that road was something not even the HOA's oldest, dustiest covenant could touch. The process of obtaining an official wetland designation wasn't fast, and it wasn't simple. It required formal assessment by a certified wetland delineator, submission of documentation to both state environmental authorities and the Army Corps of Engineers, which, under the Clean Water Act, holds jurisdiction over wetland designations in the United States, as well as a waiting period for review and any potential challenges. Daniel's attorney helped him navigate every step. The environmental consultant he had hired became a key figure in the process, providing detailed reports on the hydrology of his backyard pond, the soil composition, and the documented presence of wetland indicator plant species among his native garden plantings. The 3 native bee species were included in a supplementary biodiversity report that the consultant described, in her professional opinion, as unusually robust for a residential property of this size. The review took several months. During that time, Complaint 14, Karen's last, worked its way through the HOA's internal process. The HOA board, by this point visibly exhausted by the entire situation, scheduled a formal hearing. Daniel attended. He sat across a folding table from 3 board members who looked like they genuinely wished they were anywhere else. And he listened as Karen presented her case with the energy of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. She brought printed photographs. She brought highlighted sections of the 1987 vegetation guidelines. She brought a binder. Daniel brought his attorney. His attorney made 3 points. First, the 1987 vegetation list had never been formally re-ratified by the board, making its enforceability legally questionable at best. Second, every single one of the 14 complaints had been filed by the same individual, raising the question of whether this constituted a pattern of targeted harassment rather than legitimate community concern. Third, and this was the point that made the room go quiet, Daniel's attorney informed the board that a formal application for state and federal wetland designation had been submitted for the property, was currently under review, and that any HOA enforcement action taken during or after that review period could constitute illegal interference with a federal environmental process. Karen's binder stayed closed for the rest of the meeting. The board voted 3-0 to dismiss Complaint 14 and place a temporary moratorium on any further landscaping-related complaints regarding Daniel's property pending the outcome of the environmental review. Karen stood up, said something that the minutes would later record simply as "objection noted," and walked out. For months after that meeting, the designation came through. Daniel's backyard was officially, legally, and permanently classified as a protected wetland ecosystem under state environmental code, with additional protections triggered by its Federal Clean Water Act qualification. What that meant, in practical terms, was extraordinary. The land was now subject to environmental protection statutes that sat entirely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The HOA's covenants, their vegetation lists, their complaint processes, their inspection rights as they related to the landscaping of that specific area, none of it applied anymore. Any attempt to compel Daniel to alter, remove, or modify the designated wetland area would require challenging a state and federal environmental classification in court. The HOA's own legal counsel, when consulted, reportedly used the phrase "do not touch this" in their written advisory to the board. The garden that Karen had reported 14 times was now one of the most legally protected pieces of residential land in the entire county. Word spread through the neighborhood the way word always spreads in neighborhoods, slowly at first, then all at once. People who had watched the situation from a distance started appearing at Daniel's fence line, asking to see the garden, asking how it had happened. A local nature group reached out and asked if they could use the property as a case study for urban rewilding. A journalist from a regional environmental publication wrote a short piece about it. Daniel framed that piece and hung it in his entryway, not out of arrogance, but because it represented something he wanted to remember, that doing the right thing, slowly and carefully and without cutting corners, had produced something real. As for Karen, she did not leave the neighborhood. She stayed. She still attended HOA meetings. But something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The complaints stopped. The binders disappeared. The half-closed blinds still moved occasionally when Daniel was outside working in the garden, but the envelopes stopped coming. Whether it was legal fear, exhaustion, or some private reckoning that nobody else was privy to, the campaign ended as suddenly as it had begun. Daniel continued to tend his wetland garden through every season. He added a small wooden walkway so he could move through it without disturbing the root systems. He installed a simple rain gauge near the pond and began keeping a nature journal, logging every species he spotted, every change in the water level, every new plant that established itself without his help. The garden had taken on a life entirely its own. It didn't need him to defend it anymore. The law did that now. And somewhere in the HOA's filing cabinet, 14 complaints sat in a folder that nobody would ever act on. Permanent proof that obsession, when it pushes hard enough against the right person, sometimes builds the very fortress it was trying to tear down.